Greg Redk Mods, and welcome to episode 4 of season 2 of my Mac Pro series. In this episode, we will be debunking common myths and misconceptions about the 1, 1, 2, 1 Mac Pros and the 3, 1 Mac Pros. Now, this episode will be covering many different myths about flashing and hardware changes and whatnot. And we'll be covering each and every one of them that I can think of, that I've been asked of in the past, and just recently even. And I'll be addressing all of these myths and explaining to you what the real truth is, and going into good detail about a lot of it. So anyway, we'll start off with the first myth right now. This myth is talking about flashing your 1, 1 Mac Pro to a 2, 1 Mac Pro, and it becoming magically a 64-bit EFI. Many people believe if you update your 1, 1 EFI to a 2, 1, you automatically have 64-bit EFI. Well, here's the problem. The 2, 1's also a 32-bit EFI Mac. In fact, here's an example. Take a look at this picture right here. Okay, that's a 1, 1 Mac Pro. Now take a look at this picture right here. That's a 2, 1 Mac Pro. Did you see anything different? If you said yes, you're lying, because it's the same Mac Pro. This is the same picture. There's no differences in this hardware. And so basically, that's your first sign there. You're not getting 64-bit EFI, because they're literally the same computer, and even in fact, you can run the same CPUs in both of them even without being flashed. And that's just because it's the same hardware, which came out at around the same time, and it was before 64-bit EFI existed. People get this misconception all the time, thinking that a 1, 1 is different from the 2, 1. It isn't whatsoever. It just has more CPU compatibilities, but the 1, 1 can run those too, and you can upgrade it to a 2, 1. But like I said before, it came out before 64-bit EFI came out. So Apple never released any 64-bit EFIs for the 1, 1 or 2, 1. We're talking about a 3, 1 or newer when we get a 64-bit EFI. So that's a quick debunking there. Anyway, so now let's head over to my computer here. I'll bring up some graphics for you to see for our next few myths. Let's go. Okay, now that we've covered the first myth, we will now cover myths pertaining to the logic boards themselves. Now, as we can see here, I have created some useful graphics to help you understand everything I will be explaining. Now, before we continue, I would like to tell you that the 3, 1 image you see here has been skewed, and in that case that means there's some areas that aren't proportionate and aren't quite right. But it's still a very good image to help you understand the differences and see the differences. But I thought I'd let you guys know because I couldn't find the right picture and I wanted everything to look good in the video. So anyway, let's continue. First myth coming up, we will be covering Mac RAM. Now, this myth I consider a myth. A lot of people don't. But if you saw episode 23 of last season and all of its continued parts, I explained to you that 64 gigs of RAM just isn't worth it. It may run, but it may also run very poorly. And even if you do get it to run properly, there's not any major advantage to it. In fact, it could actually hinder some of your performance. So in this case, that is the reason why I can run 64 gigs is in brackets under the 1, 1, 2, 1 board. And in this case, I would not recommend you having 64 gigs of RAM in your board. So anyway, that's the end of that myth. And now as we continue on, we'll be covering two myths at once, and I'll explain to you what I mean. Now on the left, as we can see in a red circle right here, we have a heatsink, and on the right we have a bare chip. Now I'll explain in the next part of the video why this chip is bare. But right now, what we are looking at right now is the chipsets to the boards. On the left we have the Intel 5000X, and on the right we have the Intel 5400. Now these chipsets are totally different and incompatible with each other. And this is where the new myth that we're covering right now comes up. People believing that you can take the 1,1, 2,1, and flash a 3,1 EFI onto it, which is not possible. People believe that if you do that, you can then enable 64-bit EFI on the 1,1, 2,1. You can't. The 1,1, 2,1 is 32-bit EFI, and it will always be 32-bit EFI. The reason why we can't flash these to the newer version is, first off, the incompatible chipsets. If you'd managed to flash the system, you would have a brick. That's just plain and simple. The system would not work, period, ever again. So even if you want to try it, don't try it, because you'll end up with a useless system. Now, you may think, well, maybe I can hack the EFI and add the instruction sets in for the chipset for the 5000X. You can't do that either because it's an Intel EFI, and Intel EFIs are unhackable. They're so encrypted, no one's ever hacked them. So it's just not possible. Don't try to flash your 1,1, 2,1 to a 3,1 because it will fail, and if you're successful, you'll have a brick. You can't go from a 32-bit EFI to a 64-bit EFI doing it that way. The only way you could do that is by swapping the boards, which we'll also be covering later on in the video. But anyway, getting back to the point, another reason why people would want to flash the EFI to a newer EFI or try to modify their EFI is because of SSE 4.1 CPU support. Some people believe that they can flash their EFI and add the support for those CPUs. Now, it is true that the Intel 5000X did support later Xeon 5400 series CPUs, but it was only for certain server systems that were not made by Apple, and it was only available through a BIOS update that only certain systems got. So it's not possible for the Mac Pro because it was never updated for the 1,1, 2,1. People believe that you may just be able to put the CPUs in a 1,1, 2,1. If you put a newer 771 CPU into your 1,1, 2,1 that isn't one of these, it will not boot. It will not post. It will not chime. These are the only CPUs that the 1,1, 2,1 support. And the one that's unofficially supported was one that didn't come from Apple, but does support the 5000X chipset and the EFI that's in the system. Now, the 3,1, this is not really a myth. These are all the CPUs that are supported in the 3,1, and like I said, these will not work in the 1,1, 2,1. These CPUs right here we see for the 3,1 have SLAN and then a small x in brackets. Now, this is the stepping code for the CPU. Early 5400 Xeon CPUs were the SLA series, and the ones that were all supported by this board were the SLAN series. These were all the CPUs, the early CPUs that were supported for this system. Later on, around the time the 3,1's production time ended, Intel introduced a new stepping which replaced all these CPUs. They were the same model number but different stepping. They were the SLB steppings. Now, these steppings are not compatible in any way whatsoever. So when you're buying a CPU for a 3,1 board, you cannot use a SLB CPU. Only SLA will work. If it is an SLB, you will not get a post, you will not chime. And because of that reason, you cannot run the X5492, which came out right at the beginning of the SLB steppings. So when you're searching for a CPU to upgrade your 3,1 board, keep that in mind. You have to make sure it is an SLANT stepping CPU, and one of these that you see listed here. So anyway, let's continue to the next part of the video, and we'll cover the last myth and wrap everything up. Okay, so the final one is kind of a myth and a misconception at the same time. This myth is a myth about upgrading a 1,1, 2,1 to a 3,1 board. Now, it is possible. It is very possible to do, because in fact, the cases of the 1,1, 2,1, and the 3,1 are identical on the inside, more or less. You can swap out many different components from this and put it in this, and vice versa. The thing is, this is where we get into the price problem. Now, the 1,1, 2,1, brand new, if you're lucky, you can find one for probably around $80 to about $220 some, if you're really lucky on where you're looking. Where the 3,1, you can find them for around $200 to $300, depending on where you look. And that's not for the high-end ones, but just the base model, for instance. Mine was $225 when I got mine. And when I'm finished, all said and done, building it up, it will probably be around $350. This, when it was all built up, cost me about $300. So there's a little bit of play here and there. But keep the prices in mind, and I'll be posting the most cheapest prices I can find online for each part I name off. Now, before we continue, I'd like to explain to you the parts that actually can be transferred from here to here. And that would be the optical drives, the hard drives, and the RAM modules themselves. But that's about it. That and the case, of course. The case is also transferable, and the rear fan right here. That's it, though. Everything else basically has to be replaced. And this is why. Now, if you guys have remembered the naked chip that was on the board in this picture right here, you'll notice that, of course, there was no heatsink on it. The reason for that is because the 3,1 uses a very big specialized heatsink because the chipset runs really hot. And there's two different types. A smaller one for the 1 CPU quad-core setup, and a bigger one for a 2 CPU 8-core setup. And if you look in here, this black piece right in here, that is the heatsink right there. It is huge. And whenever you go and buy a 3,1 board, you're not going to get that, usually. You'll have to go out and buy that separately. Where with the 2,1, it comes with the board 99% of the time. So that's the first price you have to consider. The front fans, even though they look identical, they're not. This has an extra screw down here, which screws into the original built-in speaker down here for the 3,1. And I'm not really sure if I believe that's swappable between the two, but the 3,1's speaker is different. But getting back to the fans, even though it's nearly identical, isn't the same. If you plug a 1,1, 2,1 fan into a 3,1, the top fan will work and the bottom won't, I believe. It might be the other way around. And it can cause a lot of issues with the fans. They're just not compatible, so you'd have to replace that too. Also, if you notice the openings for the RAM, for instance. First off, the RAM trays are totally different. When you go and buy a board, you're going to have to replace these RAM trays with these RAM trays. And as you can see here, they're not the same. These are much more narrow and are not compatible with the these are not compatible with the 3,1 board. So you have to order these separately also, because these never come with the motherboards either. And as you can see here, because this cage here is more narrow and built differently, you have to order a new cage too. And this piece here is actually wider than this piece because the cage is more narrow on that. So you'll have to buy a new piece here too. I mean, of course, you can reuse this one, but then you'll have a gap about that wide in it, and it won't look right. Plus, it may hinder some airflow. And that's just a start when it comes to transferring everything over to another case. You also have to consider that the 3,1 power supply is very different from this one. They may look the same, but they are quite different. I have read online that some people have managed to get the 1,1, 2,1 power supply to work in the 3,1, but it's very rare, and most people said that it is impossible, and I agree with them. You'd still have to consider buying a whole new power supply too, and the 3,1 power supplies are much more expensive because they have a bad problem about failing. I don't know why. Most people are lucky and they don't fail on them, but they've been known to fail quite a lot, and they're hard to come by because of that. So you'd have to order a new one of those, and they're much more expensive than a 1,1, 2,1 power supply. So when it's all said and done, and I don't think I've covered everything needed to be covered to transfer everything, but there's the biggest parts there. When it's all said and done, you will end up with if you built a 2,1 into a 3,1, you'd end up with a huge pile of 2,1 parts and a Frankenstein computer built out of 2 different generations of Mac Pros for a lot more than just going and buying a 3,1. So instead of having 2 Mac Pros like I do right here, which looks awesome, by the way. It's a really neat thing to be able to brag about. You have 2 Mac Pros. All right. In the end, this is a lot cheaper buying a new Mac Pro 3,1 to go with your 2,1 than it is to turn this 2,1 into a 3,1. Plus, you'll have 2 Pros to play around with. So, in the end, this myth is debunked, because it's a lot more expensive. And I'll be showing you the grand totals of price differences here, just to give you a rough idea of how bad it really is. Anyway, so that's that myth there. You can't build up a 1,1, 2,1 to a 3,1 properly without it costing a lot of money. It's not worth it. You might as well just go and buy a 3,1 and have 2 Pros like I did. So anyway, that's all the myths there is to cover right now. I may end up coming up with some more and making another video on it. But right now, that's the end of this episode. And in the next episode, I believe I'll be talking about video cards one last time, and then we'll jump into the 3,1 setup and all those videos coming up. Anyway, so that's the end of the video, and thank you for watching. This has been a Rutke Mods video.
Hello, I'm Greg Rutke.